Io sono Renata Carloni ed è veramente un piacere introdurre il professor Adam Ledgeway dell'Università di Cambridge. Il professor Ledgeway è Professor of Italian and Romance Linguistics and Chair of the Faculty of Modern and Medieval Languages. Allora, i suoi interessi includono, mescolerò un po', diciamo, la mia introduzione sarà un po' in italiano con qualche parola di inglese, ma il professore parlerà in inglese. Quindi i suoi interessi includono comparative history, morphosyntax of the Romance languages, Italian dialectology, Latin, Italo-Greek, syntactic theory and linguistic change. Il titolo della conferenza è Testing Linguistic Theory and Variation to Their Limits, The Case of Italo-Romance. Il professor Ledgeway indagherà come la ricca e documentata variazione linguistica delle lingue romanze e in particolare dei dialetti italiani presenta una impareggiabile, unica abbondanza di dati linguistici interessanti non solo per la linguistica romanza, ma anche per la linguistica generale. Io vorrei sottolineare una cosa, cioè soltanto che l'approccio del professor Ledgeway è rivolto a interrogare i dati dai corpora, dai blocchi di parole e dalle ricerche di dialettologia italiana. Quindi è orientato a interrogare i dati piuttosto che a usare i dati in modo non mediato per confermare delle teorie esistenti. Quindi, allora, come si muove il professore? Si muove da un lato, la varietà linguistica italiana rappresenta un terreno fertile e ancora, come dice esplicitamente il professore, sottoutilizzato e che può svolgere, quindi un terreno che può svolgere un ruolo centrale nel mettere alla prova le ortodossie linguistiche e nel modellare nuove prospettive relative a cambiamento, alle strutture e alla variazione linguistica. Dall'altro lato, il professor Ledgeway ci illustrerà come la conoscenza di alcune idee cardine, alcune idee principali della teoria linguistica e degli studi di sintassi hanno un ruolo centrale per interpretare le strutture di questa varietà linguistica italiana e in particolare per capire le strutture del primo periodo di affermazione della lingua volgare, che sono arrivate a noi attraverso i testi scritti. Quindi la ricerca del professore è orientata a collegare la ricerca filologica tradizionale delle lingue romanze con le conoscenze e intuizioni della grammatica generativa. Però non abbiate paura, perché il professor Ledgeway introdurrà sì qualche concetto della teoria linguistica, accompagnata da qualche descrizione, ma la sua conferenza sarà assolutamente accessibile a tutti quelli che hanno una buona conoscenza della lingua italiana. A questo punto non mi rimane altro che dare la parola al professore.
Thank you for those extremely kind words, and thank you for inviting me to come and speak today. In fact, the Professoressa's words sum up my talk very, very neatly, in as much as I'm going to talk about Italian and the dialects of Italy, within Italy, in terms of what they can tell us about the human mind and language, but also use those same concepts to tell us how we should interpret the language that we speak and the language that we used to write, in many cases, in the past. So as you can see in my title then, I talk about the case of Italo-Romance. Very briefly, by Italo-Romance, we mean not only Italian, but also the sister languages of Italian, which are spoken within Italy, namely what Italians conventionally call dialetti, dialects, but they're not dialects of Italian, they are dialects of Italy. Namely, they are simply spontaneous versions of Latin as it has been spoken throughout Italy without much influence from education and learning through time. Whereas Italian, as we know, has its origins in the 14th century dialect of this city. When it then came to preeminence as a language, then it was distinguished from all the other volgari, the other spoken vernaculars through Italy, whether it be Venetian, Neapolitan, Sicilian, etc., which then became dialects and obviously sort of in some way subordinate to Italian. And the important thing to note is that Italian dialects, which are still spoken by the majority of Italians today, are extremely rich sources of investigation. In fact, you don't need to go to places like Australia or the UK or the Baltic, whatever, to look for exotic languages. There is so much variation within Italy just looking at the dialects of Italy that you can find all you actually really need to know about language by looking at the languages which are spoken within Italy. Okay, so let's begin then. So if you look at the top of the handout, Italo-Romance has contributed in many, many ways to our understanding of the structure of language. And one area which has been particularly important is the study of so-called parameters. Those are simply the dimensions along which languages are said to vary. Okay, so language X does Y and language Z does A. They have two separate properties. Okay, and the study of parameters then is simply to show that languages are not wild in any sense, but follow a certain set of finite rules, which you can say are language or language specific. Okay. To take one example, if you look at the examples in 1 and 2 on the handout, okay, about 30, 40 years ago, an Italian linguist, Luigi Rizzi, found or discovered that there's a subtle difference between English and Italian in terms of how far you can move things in a sentence. So you look at the sentence in 1a from English, a relative clause, your brother, to whom they told lies. We can see that to whom has been moved from its underlying position to the start of the clause. I think we will agree with that. An Italian can do exactly the same thing. Tuo fratello a cui hanno raccontato bugie. So there's no difference between Italian and English. However, if we extend the domain in which you move the relative pronoun to include across another verb, as you can see in 2a, then we have your brother to whom I wonder which lies they told, which most English speakers judge to be ungrammatical, hence the asterisk. Okay? But most Italian speakers apparently accept the same sentence 2b. Tuo fratello a cui mi domando che bugie abbiano raccontato. It shows a very subtle difference between native speakers of English and native speakers of Italian. There is a parameter in how far you can move relative pronouns. Italian, though, behaves like English if you try and move the relative pronoun to another clause up, as in example 2c, tuo fratello a cui temo che si domandi che bugie abbiano raccontato, becomes almost impossible to understand at that point. Okay? So what's the solution? Well, Rizzi suggested then that basically there's a difference in English and Italian in terms of not how far you can move something, but in terms of what you can move over and what you can't move over. And he argued that there's a parameter that says that in a language like English, the obstacle to movement is a inflected verb phrase. So if you look at example 1a, we've got they told. So we've moved to whom over they told, and that's fine. You can move over one boundary. If you look in 2a on the other hand, you can see that to whom is moved over they told and I wonder. That's going too far. Okay? So move over two boundaries and it becomes ungrammatical. What happens in Italian? Well, in Italian we have to define barriers, obstacles to movement in different ways. In Italian, it's not a verb, an inflected verb that is a barrier. It's a whole clause. So you can see in 1b, tuo fratello cui hanno raccontato bugie, it's moved to the top of the clause, hasn't moved over one clause. In 2b, tuo fratello a cui mi domando che bugie abbiano raccontato is grammatical because a cui has crossed only one clause, che bugie abbiano raccontato. Okay? But 2c you can see is ungrammatical, so it's moved over two clauses. So it's very subtle, don't have to worry about the details. It simply shows you then there are subtle differences, parameters in what's possible and what's not possible in two different languages. Okay? I'll come back to this later. Another important aspect in which the study of language and study of Italian and Italo-Romance is important is in understanding, if you like, what are known as language universals, those principles of grammar which are said to hold of all languages. Italian and the dialects are really important in this respect because they often show that so-called orthodoxies about what is possible is not necessarily borne out by looking at Italian or looking at the dialects of Italy. Take one sort of simple example. You may or may not have heard or remember from studying languages and studying languages like Latin as well, that we often talk about verbs being finite and non-finite. Okay, so verbs which are finite are those that have lots of inflection for person and number and tense marking, and non-finite verbs are things like participles and gerunds and infinitives, which lack all those rich inflectional markings. So traditionally it's claimed then that verbs come in two types. There are finite verbs and non-finite verbs. So you can see there on the handout, finite verbs are plus tense plus agreement. They have marking for tense and agreement. So look at examples in 3a. She returns home. Lei torna a casa. The final A on torna and the final S on returns, okay, shows you some rich agreement. And if you have rich agreement on the verb, it allows you also to have a subject. Hence we've got she and lei in our 3a examples. However, non-finite verbs, which don't have any marking for tense and any marking for agreement, as in the 3b examples, prima di tornare a casa, Gianni telefonato a Luca, or before returning home, John rang Luke, because these are non-finite, they can't have subjects. They can't occur with an overt subject. As you can see by them grammatically saying things like prima di lei tornare a casa is completely unacceptable, in the same way that in English, before she returning home is unacceptable. Okay? So the usual idea then that verbs come in two types, finite and non-finite. However, watch out, look at the Italian dialects. So look at example 4a, which comes from a dialect spoken in Liguria, where we have non serve egni u vigile, which is literally non serve venire il vigile. We have an infinitive, venire, and we have a subject, il vigile, which means then non serve che venga il vigile, but we're using an infinitive with its own subject, which is not supposed to be possible. Namely, we have a so-called non-finite verb form, which is behaving like a finite verb form. It shows you it's not a binary opposition, that there must be a continuum of what we understand in terms of finiteness. There must be other ways of understanding it. Other examples are things like 4b from Sardinian, non voglio avvenire tue, literally non voglio avvenire tu. Which you know would be completely ungrammatical in standard time, yeah? Non voglio che tu venga. You've got to use a finite clause with a subjunctive. But in these dialects, you can use infinitives with their own subjects. Or another example 4c from Neapolitan, ci vogliono 10 minuti per partire il treno, okay? So, ci vogliono 10 minuti per partire il treno. Again, prima che parta, whatever your choice is in Italian, okay? But so we have forms then which are questioning what we traditionally understand by finiteness. There must be a third type of non-finiteness or finiteness. Let's move on to page 2. So looking at typological variation, studying Italian in the dialects is also important because it allows us to talk about typology in interesting ways, namely what groups or types of languages do we find in the world? And we tend to think that there are certain types. So English behaves in a certain way, like other Germanic languages, Italian like other Romance languages, and then we might want to say that they behave altogether in a very similar way because they're Indo-European languages. Okay? So looking at typology, so there are certain expectations we may have about languages, about language types. However, we find that often again Italian the dialects tell us strange and unexpected things about what you can do in language. Look at table 1. Forget the other Romance varieties like Galician and Leonese. Let's look at Old Neapolitan and Sardinian. These varieties have infinitives again, so cantare, venire, mangiare, etc. But they're strange in that you can add endings to them. Okay? You can have inflected infinitives. So if you take the example of Sardinian, we've got cantare. Cantare po, I to sing. Cantares, you to sing. Cantaret, she or he sings. It's as if you can say in English, Mary decides to drinks, which obviously you can't say, but you can in these varieties. They have infinitives, but they add endings which indicate person and number. Really exotic. So look at examples like 5a from Old Neapolitan. We have è ora di levarmi dallo letto. Okay? So literally then, è ora di ci alzare, but not alzare, alzare mo. Got this bit on the end, mo, which tells you it's first person plural. Okay? Something which you don't find by looking at French, looking at Italian, looking at Spanish. Okay? It's a peculiarity of a certain number of small Romance varieties. Some Italian dialects go even further. So you look at table 2 and look at the right-hand sort of columns. We see again Old Neapolitan. In Old Neapolitan, you could add endings also to participles in gerunds. So things like mangiando, you can add mo, no, vo, etc. to the end. Similarly for present participles like vedente, vedente mo, vedente ti, etc. Okay? So look at example in 6a. We've got an example with a gerund. We've got tirandono certi pescatori la rete dal mare. So it's not only tirando alcuni pescatori, it's tirando no. It's a gerund which is agreeing with its subject, which again is completely unexpected from a purely Italian point of view. Okay, let's stay with inflection. Let's look on page 3. A really acute example of this is a dialect spoken in Le Marche. Okay, so in central Italy, just to our right, as it were, to the east. Okay, there's a dialect spoken in a village known as Ripatranzone. Okay, and the adjective for the dialect spoken there is ripano. So people live in Ripatranzone speak the dialect ripano. This dialect is really, really weird. Okay, it really is. Let's begin by looking at what you do with verbs in nouns. Look at table 3. So in table 3, you can see I've given you the nouns for son and daughter. So take it son, figlio, singular, masculine, plural, figli, so rather like Italian, okay? If you then look at feminine nouns and adjectives, they behave a bit like Italian, but they invert the vowels. So the singular, so figlia, you can see is figlie, but figlia is figlia. That's not the weird bit, honestly, that looks weird already, but let's look at the weird bit. So we see then that nouns and adjectives, like in Italian, they show agreement for number and gender, singular, plural, masculine, feminine. Look now what verbs do. I've given you there in the second part of table 3, the verb magna, which is mangiare, to eat, okay? So if I am a male and I say I am eating, I say magnu. If I'm a woman and I say I'm eating, I say manje. See, it's behaving like an adjective rather than like a verb. Similarly, if I say you are eating male, it's still magnu. So magnu is ambiguous. It means both I eat, male, tu, masculine, eats, and also he, lui, mangia. Okay? And simply magne means io donna mangio, tu donna mangi, e lei mangia. So it's not behaving like a verb at all. It doesn't care about indicating first or second or third person. I simply want to indicate whether I'm male, female, okay, and singular and plural. So if you look at the other parts of the paradigm, we eat, magnemi, male, or mixed male and female, magnema, feminine, plural. It's weird, yeah? It's behaving in a way which you wouldn't expect typologically. It doesn't stop there. So, but if you want to look at some real examples, look at things like 8a. So we've got facetto nu gira, I took a trip, okay? Which would be ungrammatical, but I mean, it's like saying, you could say in Italian, 9a, which you can't say, obviously, rather than saying feci un giro, feccio, io uomo feccio, ma io donna feccia, or something, okay? So it's showing that all verbs agree for gender and number, rather than person. Again, you think that's weird, it doesn't stop there. This dialect of Ripatranzone goes even further. Basically, agreement has contaminated the whole language. Okay? Things that you wouldn't expect agree, like numbers, prepositions, conjunctions, everything agrees. So look at examples in 10. 10a, we've got le fracchi, the boy, il ragazzo, le fracchine, la ragazza, the girl, has slept, è dormito, if it's male, but è dormite, if it's feminine. Or an example like 10b, mamma stava cucinando. As if you're saying literally, mamma stava cucinanda. We're having agreement again on a gerund. Turn to the examples in 11. So that everything agrees. So if you want to say, I am hungry, I am thirsty. If you're a male, you say, ho famo. If I'm a woman, ho fama. So you can see there, c'hai famu, c'hai setu, thirsty, but if I'm female, c'hai fame, c'hai sete. Yeah, same with aver paura, you can see aver bisogno di qualcosa. Noi abbiamo bisogni, io ho bisogno, but io donna ho bisogna. Okay, it's really, really strange. Also, things like interrogatives, you can see in 12. If I say when I pass by, I'm a male, quando passo. If I'm a female, quanne passe. Everything is contaminated. So a really striking example, again typologically, things like 13. We have prepositions which are agreeing. It's something you find in languages like Welsh, in Irish, okay? You don't expect to find this in a language like Italian or Italian dialects. So you can see in 13a, dopo l'udì, di giorno, masculine, dopo, but after the night, dope le notte. So as if we can say dopo il giorno and dopa la notte. We'll come back to the patranzone in a minute. So basically, I hope to have shown in this very short introduction then that looking at the evidence that we get from not only Italian but also the dialects of Italy, we can do a lot with it. We've got a rich testing ground. It can tell us a lot about language, the structure of language, which we know makes us human, okay? But at the same time, we can take the theories that we're looking at to try and explain these facts and put them back into our languages and our data, especially our early texts, to tell us something about how we might understand people spoke or wrote in the past, for example. So let's begin then by point 2, what Italo-Romance can do for syntactic theory. So if you look at Italian dialects and Italian, what can it tell us about language in general? Okay, let's begin with the so-called pro-drop parameter. I imagine lots of you, well, most of you probably never heard of the pro-drop parameter, okay? Again, basically, linguists have noticed then that languages come essentially in 2 varieties. And there's a quote there from Chomsky, which you don't have to read. I'm going to tell you what he's saying. He's basically saying then that there are languages that have rich inflection, like Italian. Parlo, parli, parla, parliamo, where the ending tells you who the subject is. So we know that it would be quite weird for me to say, io stamattina mi sono alzato alle 5, io ho preso l'autobus, io poi ho preso l'aereo, io sono venuto qui, ho preso un taxi. Just use the pronoun would sound really, really strange in this case, okay? In the unmarked case, in Italian or in Spanish or in Portuguese, you take the pronoun out. So you can drop pro-drop parameter, okay? But in languages where the verbs don't have much inflection, like in English, speak, 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 okay? You can't reconstruct who the subject is. So you have to obligatorily put the pronoun in, okay? So English then is not a pro-drop language. You can't drop the pronoun, whereas Italian, you can, okay? So the argument usually goes, if you look on page 5 then, that we find languages like English. So in English, you have to put the pronoun in, he cries, and by implication then, that means you must have dummy subjects. You can't say rains, snows, you've got to say it rains, it snows, it is necessary, etc. Okay? Whereas we know that in Italian, then you usually drop the pronoun, piange, and you say piove. You can't say lui piove, lei piove, quello, ciò piove. It's completely ungrammatical. There are no dummy subjects. And linguists working on this sort of comparison then, again we're going back to Rizzi's Italian linguist, notice then, as you can see in table 4, that basically we should expect 4 types of languages. There's type 1 languages like English, where you can't ever omit the subject. And then there are languages like Italian, type 2, where you do omit the subject, and you cannot have a it dummy subject. But then he noticed that there were languages like German, I don't know if you know German, but don't worry if you don't, as in 17, which basically behaves rather like English. So you can see in 17a, he is crying, is weint, he whines. Okay, you can't say weint without the subject pronoun. And similarly, it is raining, it regnet. Okay? However, in a few sort of weird contexts in German, you can drop the it, the dummy it subject. So in 17c, we've got es wird heute getanzt, literally, it is today danced. So that means there's dancing going on today, okay? You have to have this it there. But if you change the word order around and you don't make it the first word, then you don't pronounce it. You don't use it at all. As you can see in the second variety in 17c, heute wird, today is danced. There's no s there, okay? And that fills in type 3 in our table 4. Namely, there are varieties then where you don't express I, you, he, she, etc., but you do express it, okay? Or you can not pronounce it in certain contexts. Then there's type 4. Type 4 then would be a language which is like Italian, where you have parlo, parli, parla, etc., okay? But you would have something like quello piove. And Rizzi says, for implicit reasons, languages of this type do not exist. You can probably tell what's coming next, okay? Languages like this do exist, okay? A nice example is Neapolitan, as you can see in 18. So Neapolitan is partly like Italian, so he is crying is chiagna, okay? If you want to pronounce the pronoun to be emphatic, issa, lui, okay? Chiagna. But alongside piove, in Neapolitan, the usual way of saying it is raining is often quella piove. So literally, quello piove. So Neapolitan is a language which shouldn't exist, but it clearly does, and it fills in a nice way our option 4 in table 4. Neapolitan is not the only language that does this within Romance. You can see in 19, we've got an example from Calabria. E giochi mi importa, which is literally then quello cosa mi importa, literally, okay? But you can't translate into Italian. You wouldn't use a quello there. Or Sicilian, ma e giochi c'è cosa? Ma quello che cos'è? Okay? So basically, we've got Italian dialects in which we have a it subject pronoun being used just like in English, although they behave like Italian and they say things like parlo, parli, parla. So it's a strange mix. However, this so-called pro-drop phenomenon can actually be extended further. Let's look at some old Italian texts. And I'll give you some examples in 20 and 21, some old French, if you like old French as well. But let's stick with Old Tuscan. So in 20a then, we've got manifestamente l'ho veduto nelle cose, which I'm sure we'll understand. It's pretty close to modern Italian. Okay? And we can see then that I've indicated that there's no subject pronounced there, that black sort of circle, okay? Which indicates then that we can understand that there's a io there which is not being pronounced. The strange thing you might not have known, and if you read enough early Italian, you will soon come to realize this, is that sentences like 20a are very normal, and 20a is a main clause. Yeah, do you agree that it's not a subordinate clause? It's not I think that. It's not when Mary came in, okay? It's a main clause. But if you look what happens in embedded clauses, as an example in 21a, we've got egli conosce in old Italian meant sa, as in sapere, egli conosce certamente che egli aveva ucciso lo migliore cavaliere del mondo. That egli of ch'egli is the same egli as the egli conosce. It's just like English. He knows that he had killed. That tells us there's a different rule. In Old Italian, in Old Tuscan, you can't drop subjects as you can in modern Italian. Basically, the rule seems to be, if you've got a subordinate, an embedded clause, you have to pronounce the io, the tu, the egli. So if you like then, unlike modern Italian, Old Italian was only partially able to drop the pronoun. So if you try and translate something like 21a into modern Italian, you can see in 22, yeah? Lui sa certamente che lui aveva ucciso il migliore cavaliere del mondo. Then what happens to modern Italian, that means somebody else. If you mean it's he, the same as the subject, then you don't pronounce the subject, okay? So by putting in lui, it's often what is known as switch reference. You're switching, changing the reference. So instead of the grammar of Old Italian, the grammar of modern Italian, in this case, the grammars are very different. Okay? We can't presume to understand Old Italian because we know modern Italian, which is an important point. So we're seeing there, not only does type 4 languages, do type 4 languages exist, like Neapolitan, we've seen then there's also another type of null subject we need to think about, the one we find in Old Italian and Old French, which is only found in main clauses. So we've got actually 5 now types, but there may even be a 6th type. Let's go back to our old friend Ripatranzone, that really strange dialect has this infectious agreement. Remember, we said that you get things like magnu, 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 I eat, you eat, he eats, and magna, 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 I eat, you eat, feminine, and she eats, okay? Now, the usual argument is then that in languages like French and in languages like Italian and Spanish, okay, you can drop the pronoun because the verb ending recovers the subject, the person, okay? Mangio means io, mangi means tu. Look at this verb, magnu, magna. What does it tell you? It simply tells you it's singular and it's masculine or singular and feminine. It doesn't care about telling you whether it's I, you, or the he or she bit you can get, okay? So we have what looks like another type of null subject, because this dialect is also a null subject dialect. I don't usually pronounce pronouns. But here, the verb doesn't recover the person, it recovers gender. So if like we've got 6 types. By looking at Italian dialects and in Italian, we've seen that there's actually more than 3 types of languages. There are 6, which is a good result. Okay, let's move on to 2.2 verb positions. I'm sure when you've learned a Romance language like Italian, as native speakers of English, you realise that you can't put your verb in the same position as you can in English. So take a sentence like 23b, John always sang, Mary still drinks or something, okay? You know that you can't typically translate that into a language like Italian. You can't say Maria sempre canta, Gianni già guida, okay, as you can in English. So if you're comparing 23a and 23b, we see then that the verb in English is in a sort of a lower position towards the right, whereas in Italian it's in a higher position towards the left. And linguists have used evidence like this, contrast between English and Italian, to say then that if we assume that adverbs, sempre and always, occupy a fixed position in all languages, we can say then that verbs move or don't move in different languages. So we can see that in English, the verb sang doesn't move because it sits towards the right of the adverb, whereas in a language like Italian, as I've indicated there, it jumps and moves to a higher position. Okay? So we can say then that the difference between Romance in Germanic is that in Germanic, verbs don't move, whereas in Romance, they move, they hop over adverbs. Okay? That's why it's ungrammatical English to say things like Mary knows already, rather than Mary already knows. Okay? Whereas in Italian it's the opposite. However, if we open up our discussion, look at more Romance languages, okay? So let's move on to the examples, jump over to 24, let's look at examples in 25. Okay, if we introduce now more Romance languages, so in 25a we've got Calabrian, 25b we've got Romanian, 25c we've got Spanish, then we've got Italian, then we've got French. We can see by looking at the position of the verb, which I've given you in all case in bold, okay, and we've got a sentence then, perhaps she already knows the recipe. So in English you can see that knows follows perhaps and already. We can see then that in Calabrian, okay, Calabrian looks rather like English. Idja, forse, già, canuscia. So we got she, forse, già, and then the verb canuscia. Okay? So there's some Italian dialects in which look just like English. The verb doesn't seem to hop over adverbs. Okay? Which is just the same, which is also true of Romanian and Spanish. But if you look then at Italian, as you can see in 25d, we've got lei forse conosce già la ricetta. It's different from Calabrian because conosce, okay, it follows forse, but it precedes già. So verbs do move to a certain extent in Italian. If you look at French, I don't know whether you know French, French is even stricter. Verbs have to hop over all available adverbs, as you can see in 25e. Elle connaît peut-être déjà la recette. Okay? So we see then that looking at different Romance languages, looking at different dialects, you can see then that verbs don't occupy either a low position or a high position. They can occupy also middle ground positions. Similar facts given in 26, which I won't read out, looking at past participles that show you again there are lots of differences. So what can we conclude then? Well, basically, the structure of the clause is looking at these examples of verbs and adverbs then, is greater than we actually think. Okay? Verbs can occupy a series of different positions with respect to adverbs. Let's now look at 2.3, mapping of the left periphery of the clause. Okay. So if I asked you what does the sentence look like in a language like Italian, you might say it looks like something like 27. Namely, you start with the subject, Ugo. You then have a verb like prepara. You might have a compound verb, ha preparato. You might put one of those adverbs in the middle, ha sempre, ha già, ancora, whatever, preparato. Then after the verb, then you have the object, la pasta. And then you might have some optional bits, some adverbs, I've called adjuncts, things like a mezzogiorno. Okay? So our sentence then looks like something like in 27a and b, okay? Which is probably not new to you, it's what you find in most handbooks. So the sentence then starts with the subject and it ends with the object, or if there's something optional like an adverb at the end. However, the story is actually more complex in that. What you don't find typically in grammar books is what you can put in front of the subject. So if we take 27a, as I've put in 28, as our sentential core, actually, there's a space immediately to the left of the sentential core, which I've called the left periphery. And in that left periphery, we can put all sorts of things, okay? But not in any old order. There are certain intuitions that speakers have about what you can put where and in what order, okay? Lots of us know about this because we speak these languages, but we're never really taught the rules. So what are the rules? Let's do some sort of inspection of our own grammars. Well, essentially, you can put in front of the sentential core in this left periphery elements which are said to be known to us, okay, which are active. Linguists call these topics. So things which you've been talking about, things that I presume you know and that I know as well. So if we take our sentence again in 29a, Ugo ha sempre preparato la pasta a mezzogiorno. If we're talking about the pasta, we could say, la pasta, Ugo l'ha sempre preparata a mezzogiorno. Okay? And that means, as regards the pasta, Ugo is always prepared at midday. Okay? Notice, if it's a topic like this, we pick it up with a pronoun. This is la preparata. Okay? But we might be talking about Ugo. Ugo, comma, break, okay? Lui ha sempre preparato la pasta a mezzogiorno. Or we can make our mezzogiorno the thing we're talking about. As regards midday, Ugo always has prepared pasta, okay? So we've got a position then in which we can put old given information. But we can actually put more than one element there. As you can see in 30A, B, C, and D, we can have Ugo la pasta, lui l'ha sempre preparata a mezzogiorno. We can invert the order as in 30B. We can put in mezzogiorno there, okay? So you see, basically, old information can be placed in this left periphery. I'm sure you know this, you're all speaking Italian, okay? And you know when you talk about something which is given, something known to you, it's quite normal, but often looked down upon in writing, okay, as a common way of talking in Italian, okay? It's a common way of, for example, of avoiding the passive. So, Gianni fu investito da una macchina will often be in spoken Italian, Gianni l'ha investito una macchina. So, as regards John, him, has run over a car. So it's a very sort of spoken way of speaking, if you like. If you now look on page 8, okay, you can see not only can we put topics, old information in this left periphery, we can also put new information, things you didn't expect to hear about, okay? Now, in Italian, this only happens, in standard Italian at least, if the information is new and contrasted in some way, okay? And it's unlike topics, you don't pick up the thing you move there with a pronoun, and you get a strong intonational contour. So you get things like 31b, it's said out of context, sempre Ugo ha preparato la pasta a mezzogiorno, non solo oggi, okay? So by making it very contrastive, you can put it at the beginning. It's new, unexpected information. Or, a mezzogiorno Ugo ha sempre preparato la pasta, non la sera. Okay? You don't have to say non la sera, but that's sort of implied, okay? Or with a direct object in 31D, la pasta Ugo ha sempre preparato a mezzogiorno, e non le patate fritte, or something along those lines, okay? So this is new information. Now, some Italians don't accept this at all, especially in Northern Italy. They don't like these things at all. They prefer to say things like, Ugo ha sempre preparato la pasta a mezzogiorno. Okay? The further you go towards the south of Italy, the more they like these types of structures. Okay? So if you ring up a Sicilian friend of yours, okay, let's imagine your Sicilian friend is called Silvio. Okay? In standard Italian, how would you answer the phone if your name's Silvio? You'd say, pronto, sono Silvio. Okay? I'm giving you some new information. It's me, it's not mum. Okay? If you're Sicilian, you'll say, Silvio sono. Okay, you put it first, okay? So, you know, fa caldo. Sicilians don't say fa caldo, they say caldo fa. And this is also what we find also in Old Italian, which we'll come back to in a minute, okay? New information was often put at the beginning of the sentence. Now, in Standard Italian, then we either put old information or contrastively focused, yeah? So if the waiter brings you the wrong pizza, then you can use this construction. But if somebody asks you, what did you buy at the market? You can't say, me le ho comprato, unless you're Sicilian or Sardinian. Now, if you look at example 32, we can actually combine topics, old information and focus in the left periphery. But notice if we do combine them, they have to occur in the order given, topic and focus. So you get things like 32C, la pasta sempre uguale preparata a mezzogiorno. But most Italians do not allow things like 32D, sempre la pasta uguale preparata, okay? Some of you might say, well, actually, I don't mind that, okay? But some, well, so it's claimed most Italians do not allow that order. Okay? So let's go with that assumption then, that we have a structured space, okay, as you can see in 33, a left periphery in which we have topic elements which may then be followed by new information, a focus. Let's then move on to 2.31 very quickly and talk about conjunctions. Conjunctions are words like che, quando, come. Let's talk about che, okay? Che also has another version, di and a, which are used to introduce infinitival clauses. So you can make contrasts or compare things like 34, convinsi Ugo che doveva tornare, or convinsi Ugo a tornare. It seems that che and a are doing the same thing. They're both introducing a new embedded clause. Che is with a finite clause, person, tense marking, and a is used with a infinitival clause. Similarly, in 35, we've got Gianni controlla l'email prima che escano, but we have the same subject during the going out. We get Gianni controlla l'email prima di uscire. So prima che, prima di, the che and the di look as if they're doing the same sort of thing. They're both conjunctions. That's what traditional grammars tell us. Okay? However, they are not entirely parallel. Okay? Because if we try and put in one of those topic things we were just talking about, some old information, then we find that they occur in different positions. Look at the example in 36. So che la data l'ho sbagliata. So che. Then we've got la data, which is our topic, l'ho sbagliata. If we use a infinitival complement, as you can see in 36b, we get the opposite order. So la data di averla sbagliata. We cannot say so di la data averla sbagliata. It shows us then that actually there are two conjunction positions. There's one for che, which precedes all topics, and there's one for things like di and a, which follows topics in focus. I've given you that in 37. Now, just in case you didn't believe me based on what I've said so far, if you turn over, you will see, as in Table 6, that there are lots of dialects spoken in central and especially southern Italy that have two conjunctions. They don't only have one word, che, they have two. As you can see in the second column there, after a verb like say or believe, okay, verbs that typically take the indicative, not necessarily pensare, but dire at least, okay, you get a conjunction ca. Pensu ca veni, critu ca veni, pensu ca veni, criu ca veni, etc. But if you say, I want that, I expect that, where you'd find a subjunctive verb typically in Italian, okay, then use a different word. They don't use ca, they use chi. For example, Sicilian, voglio chi mangiassi, or mi, oggi mi mangia, or cu, etc. So they have two separate words, one for indicative complement clauses and one for subjunctive ones. Now, if we look what happens when we use these with those topic elements, as you can see in 38, we see we get different positions again. So in 38, we've got examples from Salento, so in the extreme south of Italy, in the heel. We've got aggiuti tu ca, I have said that, lia, she is coming. Okay? So we get ca, lia, topic. But if you say the verb want, as in 38b, oio, voglio, lo libro, the book, cu, that he buys. So we see again, these occupy different positions, as we saw with che in di and che in a in Italian. Again, even if you still don't believe me at this point by looking at these sort of Italian dialects, then look at Old Italian. Old Italian often uses both conjunctions and both positions at the same time in the same sentence. So look at example 48 from Old Tuscan. Then we've got ti facci meraviglia che io ti iscrissi, che se tu avevi poi più denari, che me li mandassi. We've got a che and a che, and we've got a se, an if clause in the middle. These things are extremely common in Old Italian. They're also found in today's dialects. So take the example in 41 from the dialect of Arielli, spoken in Abruzzo. So we have so dita, which means I have said, ho detto, ca, so che, domani, tomorrow, a Ortona, which is a sort of a locality in Abruzzo, gni luzie, con lo zio, ca, che again, okay, non ci devi andare. So we see we've got che, topic, che. It shows us then that this so-called space above the sentential call then is really rich. Okay, and as you can see in page 10 in 42, then that we have to recognize that there is a space above the sentential core, which is really quite rich. We've seen then that there are topic and focus positions. You can have more than one topic. If topic and focus co-occur, you get topic first and then focus. And then those are sandwiched between two conjunction positions, che, di, and in some dialects, we get things like ca and che. And in Old Italian, we get che, or not sometimes we get ca, etc. Okay, excuse my language. So we see then there's lots of evidence saying that there's a rich space and there's more than one conjunction position. So what are interim conclusions? I will try and speed up now. Well, essentially, we've seen then, if we go back to what we said, that there is not only 3 types of null subjects, there are 5, even 6, as we saw when we looked at ripatranzone. Verbs don't only occur in either low or high positions, they can occur in a whole variety of positions strewn across the clause. And then we've just seen that the left periphery, which we don't usually talk about, is really quite a structured space, okay, that has distinct positions which can be filled by specific elements. Okay, let's now see what linguistic theory can do for understanding our dialects and our early texts. Okay, let's go then to word order. Now, any of you who've ever studied, for example, Old Tuscan or even Old French or Old Spanish, will often be struck when you start reading it that suddenly, given your knowledge, for example, of modern Italian, you suddenly read a sentence and you realize you haven't understood it or it doesn't make sense. The word order in Old Tuscan is not the same word order as we find in modern Italian. It's not namely typically subject, verb, object. You suddenly find sentences in which you've realized you've misunderstood the subject and the object, often. Okay? Take the example in 43a from Old Tuscan then. Ciò tenne il re a grande meraviglia. You're quite tempted to take ciò as the subject there, but ciò is the object. That held the king in great marvel. I.e., the king is the subject here, and he was surprised by ciò, that. And ciò is a topic. It's given old information. Look at the example in 43b from Neapolitan. Vecchi riduce d'età juvenile. Old people, he reduced to young age. Old people there, vecchi, as it is in Old Neapolitan, vecchi, okay, is the object. It's not the subject. In this case, it's a focus. It's new information. It shows us then we can't read Old Italian texts with our modern Italian grammar. We need to know what was happening in terms of word order. Well, you might say, based on 43a and 43b, well, perhaps they just chucked the words up in the air and wherever they landed, then that was fine. There were no rules, okay? Now, that would be very doubtful, okay? Language is structured, and we hope to think it's structured, okay? And in fact, so our question then is, do we know and can we work out how Old Neapolitans and Old Tuscans wrote and spoke? Well, we can. If we go back to what we were saying about the left periphery a minute ago, we now have a straightforward solution. We saw, as you can see in 44a, that this left periphery has a space for topic and focus, old and new information, and it had 2 conjunction positions, conjunction 1, the higher one, and conjunction 2, the lower one. Okay? Now, if you look at a language like modern Italian, as you can see in 44b, we don't, in main clauses, so not in subordinate clauses, we don't pronounce the conjunction positions. Do you agree? So we say things like 44b, io in spiaggia non ci vado mai d'inverno. No modern Italian will typically say, io in spiaggia che non ci vado mai d'inverno. Do you agree? So we have these conjunction positions, but we don't use them in main clauses. Okay? They're there, but they're just vacant. The argument goes then for Old Italian and Old Neapolitan and Old Venetian that actually they used the lower conjunction position. As you can see in my representation in 44c, that is, in main clauses, the verb moves to the empty, the vacant conjunction 2 positions. You can see, so tenne, which crossed out in its original position, has now moved to the vacant conjunction position. And then there's another rule that says in Old Tuscan that you put in front of the verb something which is pragmatically salient, something which is important to you in terms of what you want to convey. That can be a topic, old information, or a focus. Remember, Old Italians spoke like modern Sicilians, okay? They put lots of new information at the beginning of the sentence as well. So we have a different rule of word order. The word order in Old Italian and Old Neapolitan and Old French then is basically in a main clause, move your verb to the vacant lower conjunction position, put something in front of it, which can either be a topic or a focus. And notice then that when you move something in front of it, which is, for example, the object, as in our example in 44c, then the subject, where does it come? Il re. It always comes immediately after the verb. That's why you find in Old Italian things like un cavallo ha il re preso, not ha preso il re. Ha il re then preso. Okay? So Old Italian then, Old Romance has a different word order. And I've represented that schematically in 43. I.e. it has a rule that says you move your verb and put it in the vacant, empty conjunction position and then front something in front of that. Those of you that do know modern German think, this is just like modern German. And it is. Okay? I.e. Old Romance was like modern German, modern Dutch, said to be a verb second language in which the verb occurs as the second idea in the clause. Okay, so if you look at examples in 46, 47, 48 and 49, which come from other Romance languages as well as Old Tuscan, you can see then that basically word order was rather free in Old Romance. You can put in front of the verb the object, as in 46, an indirect object or a prepositional object, as in 47. You can put an adverb, but you can also put, as you can see in 49, a subject, as you can in modern Italian. Maria ha preso il cavallo. But that was not the only order, and it was not the unmarked word order in Old Romance. So we resolved then an issue about word order by looking at what we said before about the structure of the left periphery. Let's return now then to, remember, the pro-drop parameter and when you can not pronounce subjects. We saw, and I've repeated examples in 50 then, that in Old Italian, for example, you don't pronounce pronouns in main clauses. So 50a, manifestamente ho, not io l'ho, rather, veduto nelle cose. But we saw that if you have a subordinate clause, an embedded clause, you have to pronounce the io, the tu, the egli, etc. As you can see in 50, should be 50b, egli conosce certamente che egli aveva ucciso. We now have an explanation. Look at the representation of 50a, which I've given you in 51a. As I just told you, in Old Tuscan, the verb moves to the vacant conjunction position, as you can see in 51a. Let's hypothesize then that if the verb moves to that vacant position, as happens in main clauses, because it's always available, it's always empty in main clauses, okay, then it licenses, it gives you a subject which you don't have to pronounce. So there's no io being pronounced. But look what happens in 51b, okay, which is our embedded clause. Ch'egli, can we move our verb now? No, because there's a che there. So aveva, has to stay in its base position. And we have to pronounce egli. So it would appear then that Old Italian, Old Tuscan, is a different type of null subject language. When you can move the verb to the vacant conjunction position, you can not pronounce the pronoun, but if you can't move it, as happens in embedded clauses, because there's always a che there, then you have to pronounce the pronoun. Okay? That now gives us a nice explanation of what's going on. Stop. Corsican, and the dialects of Corsica, which we know now, Corsica belongs to France, but was actually part of Italy and part of Tuscany, okay? You may or may not know that Corsican dialects are Italo-Romance dialects, and more specifically, they are Tuscan dialects, okay? Corsicans speak a variety of Tuscan, essentially. And Old Corsican was like Old Tuscan, okay, in as much as it had this verb second rule that said that you put the verb in the vacant conjunction position, okay? And in embedded clauses, you have to pronounce the pronoun. Now, modern Corsican dialects are no longer verb second, as is the case of modern Italian. But they've kept the rule about subject pronouns. So look at the examples, take 52a. So we've got avemo da fare devozione a tutti i santi. So dobbiamo fare le devozioni a tutti i santi. There's no subject pronoun, there's no noi there. Okay? But look, the sentence continues. Santi che no truvemo. That no is noi. Corsican has kept a part of the rule. So it's just like Italian. In main clauses, you don't pronounce the subject pronoun usually, but as soon as you enter into an embedded clause with che or quando, then you have to pronounce the pronoun. Okay? Which is quite nice. It sort of explains what we see. Okay, almost finished, really honestly. Let's move to 3.3. Let's look at the earliest Italo-Romance texts. Well, if we exclude l'Indovinello Veronese, okay, which is open to discussion whether it's Italian, whether it's Latin, and whether it's actually a bit of both. But you may or not have heard that there are 4 very short vernacular texts. Have you ever heard of these? They're so-called placiti cassinesi. Okay? Don't worry if you haven't. They're often said to be some of the earliest examples of spoken Italo-Romance, okay? Whilst Latin was still being heavily used as a language of writing. And they're very short. There's 4 of them. I give them 53. Okay, they come from 960 to 963. They were composed, written in a part of northern Campania. Okay, Capuatiano and Cesarunca. And essentially, they were a stitch-up. Okay, there were various monasteries. Okay, that were trying to steal land from some poor peasants. Okay, and to show this and to steal the land, they had to go to court and get some independent witnesses to say that this land had been used and belonged to the monastery for 20 years. So what they would do, they would get something like, say, okay, you come here, peasant, come here. Right, I want you to go into court tomorrow and say the following words. I swear that those lands, which I can see on the map in front of me, were owned by the monastery and have been for the last 30 years. Okay? Gave them some money and they went off and everybody was happy, apart from the people who lost their land. Okay? As you can see in examples in 53, just take the first one, because if you read the first one, basically you've read all the other 3 as well, because they're very, very similar. Sao co quelle terre, sao is so, io so, co is che, quelle terre, those lands, quelle terre, per quelle fine che chi contiene, so within which boundaries are contained here, so somebody's pointing now on the map in court, okay, 30 anni, 30 years, le possette parte Santi Benedetti. So the monastery of Saint Benedict owned them for 30 years. If you read the other examples in BC, you see they're virtually the same, which already tells you this is a bit iffy. Something strange here. They've been planted these words. Okay, these aren't spontaneous sort of sworn oaths. They've been told what to say by the church, by the religious authorities before they even get into the courtroom. So our questions are then, what value, if any, do these very short sworn attestations tell us about language, let's say, in southern Italy, okay, in the 10th century? Do they tell us anything at all? Well, you say, well, given that they're all very similar, probably not, because they're actually made up. They're not spontaneous spoken usage. But at the same time, if these things were being fed to witnesses who were being bought, okay, as being spontaneous language, there's perhaps in some way hyper-characterize what we might expect people to have spoken like in that era. So perhaps they are good ways of looking at how the spoken language was being spoken. But then we have a problem, they're so short. How do you interpret these texts? What does it mean? Why do we have so che quelle terre, per quelle fine che chi contiene 30 anni? Why do we have all these things stacked up at the beginning of the embedded clause? How can we work it out? We really can't, because this is all we've got. But we can work it out. Let's go back again to our structure, the left periphery. We saw that the structure of the left periphery has positions for topics and focus. We saw that you can have many topics, but only one focus. So if we interpret then our placiti in this way, as you can see in 54, we now have a straightforward way of understanding what was going on. Sao, co, I know that. Quelle terre, that's our first topic. So, as regards those lands, per quelle fine che chi contiene, within the boundaries of which are shown here, another topic. Then we've got 30 anni, I'm shouting in here, contrastly, 30 years, not 5 years, not 10 years, okay? Probably needed to be 30 years so that it could become their land, yeah? 30 years, okay? They belong to so-and-so, okay? We can see then that already the constructions that we are told today are very colloquial, topicalization, putting things at the front, already found in these earliest Italo-Romance texts, and they already conform to our syntactic structure of having topic, focus. Do one more, then we'll stop. Let's look at conjunctions again, 3.4, okay? You remember I told you that there are 2 conjunction positions, and to try and persuade you that this was true, I said that lots of Italian dialects have 2 conjunctions. They have one which is ca, you find in indicative clauses, and they have another one which is variously che, mu, cu, which you find in subjunctive clauses. So I'll give you examples like 55 from Salento, where we had, I have said ca, and I want that, oiu cu. Now what I didn't tell you is that in these same dialects that have 2 conjunctions, 2 separate words for that, 2 words for che, that if they use the ca one, which we find in indicative clauses, as you can see in 57a, te prometto che torno, I promised you that I return, you cannot omit the ca. It has to be pronounced. But what you can do, as you can see for 57b, with the subjunctive type one, the for example, cu, okay, you cannot pronounce it. You can drop it. You can say, Oggio lo facci stare zitto. I want to shut him up, with no cu. The cu is optional there. If you know something about Italian and other Romance languages, you know that Italian has a similar rule, okay? Look at the examples in 58a from Italian, okay? So I'm talking about standard Italian. I'm not talking about Italian spoken in this particular city, which is slightly more liberal, okay? But in 58a, we've got standard Italian, then we've got dicono che vuole piovere, okay? They say that, you know, it's going to rain, okay? And in standard Italian at least, but not necessarily in this city, okay? You cannot say dicono vuole piovere. But what you can say, as you can see with subjunctive type verbs, with che in Italian, sembra che voglia piovere, you can drop, especially in higher registers, the che, sembra voglia piovere. This looks a bit like Salentino. So what we could conclude, if we want to be really clever and stick to our thoughts about the structure of the left periphery and there being two conjunction positions, we could say that also Italian has two conjunctions, just like Salentino, just like Neapolitan, just like Sicilian. But it's always pronounced che, but they occupy two different positions. And that's why only one of them, the che, which you find in subjunctive clauses, is the one that you can omit, just like cu in Salentino. But the che that you use to introduce indicative clauses, just like ca, cannot be omitted. I.e., we have a dual conjunction system also in Italian. But it's hidden in Italian by the fact that it sounds the same, che, che. So we saw another variety, it's ca, che, etc. Okay. I think at that point I better stop. There's another example, but hope to have shown you then that basically we can earn a lot by looking at Italian, Old Italian, and also Italian dialects, which can tell us a lot about the structure of language. And so we can use those same things we've discovered to reinterpret Italian, as we just seen in this example, but especially also early texts, okay, where we don't have access to native speakers and we don't necessarily know what's going on in terms of word order, but we can use our knowledge of other varieties to tell us something about Old Italian and other Old Romance varieties. Thank you for listening to me.
This is just a general curiosity. I was really interested in the dialect, the ripatransone dialect that genders its verbs as adjectives. And I was just wondering, in terms of why that has sort of stuck in relation to other dialects that might have lost that if they were also deriving from these languages that we've talked about. Do you think that's something that just derives from the social customs in terms of stricter gender sort of roles, or yeah.
Okay, yeah. As far as we know, it's the only dialect within the whole of Italy, and there are thousands of dialects, literally thousands, within Italy, that has this system. There are a couple of dialects nearby that seem to have gone halfway to producing a language in which you mark gender above all on all parts of speech. So it seems to be an innovation rather than something that was once upon a time shared and then was lost and has only been retained there. We also know, because we don't, the problem with these dialects is often we don't have necessarily things like Venetian or Neapolitan or Sicilian. We don't tend to have early texts. We don't necessarily know what went on. But the earliest text that we do have of ripatransone, of ripano, seems to suggest that what happened was that there were some changes in the sound system, okay, some really strange ones that I can't even reproduce and remember here offhand, that made it look like verbs suddenly came to mark gender, but actually it was just like a vowel changing. And then people got hold of that, and then, oh, they went everywhere with it, just put it in all parts of speech. So it seems that basically it was a change that was rooted in the sound system, so the phonological system, which has then expanded into the grammar. And that's why it's only gone half the way in the other 2 or 3 dialects nearby, in that they haven't had all the same sound changes. But then, you know, the interesting question is whether it can then become part of the sociolect, in a sense, and whether it can be there as a marker of... recently, I've done some field work there, and it appears that younger speakers, as you might expect, because obviously they speak more Italian and they're more competent in Italian, tending to lose the agreement patterns that we see here, which are basically found more robustly with speakers who are sort of in their 50s and over. They do have some of them, but they don't have all of them.
Buonasera professore,
Buonasera.
Posso fare la domanda in italiano?
Certo.
Grazie. Negli esempi 29, 30, 31, 32 mi aspettavo, erroneamente, mi aspettavo di trovare anche un esempio in cui Ugo fosse al termine della frase.
Sì.
La cucina sempre Ugo, la prepara sempre Ugo. Ci può dire qualcosa su questo? Grazie.
Sì, grazie della domanda. Esiste anche, ma rispondo anche in italiano a questo punto, esiste anche quindi una periferia destra, non solo una periferia sinistra, in cui appunto troviamo elementi topicalizzati, che comunque hanno a quanto pare delle interpretazioni un po' diverse rispetto alle topicalizzazioni che troviamo comunque nella periferia sinistra. Spesso possono essere quello che si dice in inglese afterthoughts. Però alcuni degli esempi che forse lei ha citato avevano più a che fare col focus, no? Tipo, se uno fa la domanda chi ha rotto la finestra, la risposta più naturale è l'ha rotta Maria, Gianni. In quel caso appunto abbiamo un soggetto post-verbale che appunto è un soggetto focalizzato. Sì, appunto c'è anche lì qualcosa da dire sulla struttura della frase quando riguarda questa porzione, questa periferia destra, di cui non ne parla mai nessuno. Invece dovremmo parlarne, come abbiamo parlato anche della periferia sinistra. Sì. Anche per esempio c'è quell'esempio che ho dato all'inizio, per quanto riguarda la topicalizzazione come fenomeno per evitare il passivo. No? Nella lingua parlata, piuttosto che dire, la porta è stata non lo so, rifatta, la porta l'hanno rifatta, è un modo per appunto evitare il passivo.
I have a question about the dialect of ripatransone. The origins of that phenomenon of the gender declination is not Latin.
No.
Yes. No. Which is in Italy we called it sostrato or substrato. Which is the one in...
As I said before, I mean, the origins, so in as much as we're able to determine them, probably are to do with the sound system. So certain sound changes happened in certain contexts which made speakers reinterpret the sound change as actually being a marker of gender marking. And then it spread to all sorts of categories. But again, a lot of it is speculation, because we don't have data from previous speakers. But it's a really, really exotic dialect. You know, people who study Bantu languages or, Amerindian languages, always come to us with lots of, really interesting exotic data. About, I've got ripatranzone, which is, does things that your variety doesn't do.
It's not Latin, so it's...
No, definitely not, no, yeah.
We can continue the discussion during the refreshment, so many, many thanks to Professor Ledgeway for this very interesting conference.